It's Adam here for PC Monitors, and in this video I'm going to be taking a look at the AOC C24G1. This video review is part of a much longer and more detailed written review, and you can find a link to that in the description of the video, alongside information about how you can support the work that we do. As a video review, you can't see exactly what the monitor looks like firsthand. What you see depends on my camera, it depends on the processing done by my video software, by YouTube, and ultimately what's displayed on your own monitor. This monitor uses a 23.6-inch Samsung VA vertical alignment panel, and this has a 1500R curve to the screen, so that's a moderately steep curve. If you look at press images of the monitor, you'll find that the curve looks quite exaggerated, it looks quite steep, and you might think it sort of distorts the image and makes everything look unnatural. In reality, it doesn't do that at all. From a normal viewing position, it's actually a very subtle addition. It just adds a little bit more depth, but the screen isn't particularly wide as far as screens go these days, so the curve isn't actually that noticeable, and to me it doesn't really do a lot to change the experience. It just kind of gives a subtle bit of extra depth and just draws you in a little bit more. Some users would also find curved screens a bit more comfortable, so a bit better in terms of viewing comfort. Personally, I don't really have that issue with flat screens myself anyway, or curved, so it really doesn't look unnatural to me, and it's perfectly comfortable to use for me. The resolution of the screen is 1920 by 1080, so it's a full HD screen. It's not going to win any awards as far as pixel density goes. The pixel density is fairly low by modern standards. Not super low, but fairly low. So things are a decent readable size for many users. It isn't really going to wow you in terms of the level of detail it can show you in high resolution images or games or that kind of thing. But you do have to remember that the monitor is fairly affordable. It also runs at a high refresh rate, which I'll come on to later in the review. But the full HD resolution is not particularly graphically demanding, so it can actually help in that respect as well. I'm now going to talk about the external features of the monitor. So the first thing you'll notice is that it has a curve to the screen, 1500R curve, so that's relatively steep for a monitor of this size, but it's not a particularly wide monitor, so the curve's not as dramatic as you might think. The bottom bezel has a black matte plastic texture for the most part, and it also has a little textured red plastic stripe at the bottom, a matte plastic stripe. This actually has a little triangular texture to it. It's sort of a mesh composed of little triangles which interconnect. That same design is used for the ring around the point where the stand base attaches to the neck of the stand. The stand base itself has quite an interesting design, as you can see, quite angular, quite an interesting shape. The bezels at the top and side are slender. They have a dual stage bezel design, so there's a thin panel border which blends in quite seamlessly when the monitor's off, but when it's on you can see it as a kind of border around the image. I mean, you can see it in the video, it does blend quite well with the rest of the screen, and there's a very thin, hard outer component to the bezel as well. The screen surface is light matte anti-glare, so it gives you good glare handling characteristics. As always, you should try and avoid strong direct light hitting the screen, and what this means for the image quality is explored a little later in the review. The OSD controls are located on the bottom of the bezel towards the right side. They're pressable buttons and they're explored in the OSD video. From the side, the monitor is reasonably slender. You can see the stand, which offers a good amount of ergonomic flexibility quite well from this angle. It allows you to tilt the screen backwards and forwards slightly. You can also adjust the height of the screen. You can also swivel the screen left and right, so there's a little turntable mechanism at the top of the stand base there. You can't rotate the screen into portrait, but it would look rather weird because it's a curved screen. They always look a bit strange in portrait, so often that adjustment isn't included. The exact amount of adjustability is explored in the written review, so you can have the facts and figures for that if you're interested. At the rear, the monitor is mainly matte black plastic, but there are some red elements, as you can see, which use the same design shown earlier with the sort of little triangular mesh pattern on it. The included stand attaches using a quick release mechanism, so you can press that button and detach the screen. You can then find 100 by 100mm VESA holes and use an alternative stand or mount that is VESA compatible if you prefer. The ports of the monitor are down firing. and they include two HDMI 1.4 ports, DisplayPort 1.2, D-Sub or VGA, a 3.5mm headphone jack. At the other side of the stand there's an AC power input, which means that this monitor uses an internal power converter and doesn't have a power brick, and there's a K slot or a Kensington lock slot as well. There's also a cable tidy ring at the bottom of the stand neck. I'm now running Shadow of the Tomb Raider, and I'm going to talk a bit about the contrast performance of the monitor. This is a game I only downloaded a few days ago because it's only just come out, but I've already really enjoyed how the contrast performance of this monitor enhances the experience on this game. It's a game which has a lot of dark areas, lots of dark caves and tombs and passageways and that kind of thing, so having a monitor with strong contrast really does help in this title. Being a VA panel, vertical alignment panel, contrast really the main strength of this monitor, and it does have strong static contrast. I actually recorded, depending on settings used, a bit beyond the 3000:1 which is specified, and even after full calibration, including with an ICC profile, the monitor was pretty close to 3000:1, so it's pretty much as advertised in terms of static contrast. That means if you're in a dark room like I am here, things don't have an obvious deep inky look to them because the contrast isn't like an OLED screen or some of the best VA models in terms of contrast where they might be perhaps 6000:1, and OLED's certainly a lot higher than that even. So if you're in a dark room, things don't necessarily look deep and inky, but they do have more depth than you'd see on a non-VA LCD panel. For example, the competing TN models, it just doesn't look anywhere near as atmospheric as this. And it's really about the atmosphere it creates in these dark areas which I find very impressive on this monitor. It's really the atmosphere that the VA panel on this monitor brings to these dark scenes which sort of enhances the experience, and it's significantly better than what you get on the competing TN models, for example. Now obviously I am sitting in a pitch black room here because it helps to highlight the things I'm talking about on the screen, and they certainly become more obvious, the weaknesses and strengths, when you're sitting in a dark room, but I would recommend having a little bit of lighting in the room. It's good for your eyes in terms of viewing comfort, but also it helps enhance the perceived contrast if you have a bit of light. Even if you don't like strong light in the room, that's fine. Just try to have a bit of lighting around the monitor, some ambient light at least. So it does sort of lift things out a bit and help the perceived contrast. And even with moderately bright room or slightly bright room, whatever you want, the perceived contrast advantage of this over competing TN models is quite profound, I find. And when you look at the lighter elements, such as Lara's torch here, or things illuminated by the torch, you can see that the screen surface, this won't be obvious on the video, but I can see that the screen surface is fairly light. It doesn't have an obvious graininess to it, so these kind of brighter elements look quite smooth, quite pure, without strong graininess, just a little bit of graininess here and there. Combined with the strong contrast performance and the surrounding darkness, these bright areas do sort of pop out and really contrast nicely with the darkness. As a vertical alignment model, it does have a bit of black crush, or so-called black crush, and what this means is when you're looking at the centre of the screen in particular from a normal viewing position, some dark shades are a bit darker than they should be, and they kind of hide some subtle details because of that. They kind of blend into a black mass. So there's almost a kind of cone in the middle of the screen. It's on this model it's not really obvious as a distinct cone, especially when you're just looking at dark shades like this, but you will notice that they appear most blended, these dark shades, in the centre of the screen. The perceived gamma is essentially quite high, and shades are not quite as light as they should be. Some of these dark shades are darker than they should be, so they're not as distinct, these details. But if you view the same shades closer to the edge of the screen, the perceived gamma is reduced a bit and these details become more apparent. And this is more obvious if you move off-centre. Now you can see that the perceived gamma is massively reduced and there's actually far too much detail, so things just look flooded. You can also see sort of what I call VA glow really bloom out from this angle. This black crush is really quite a minor issue on this model. As minor as I've seen on a VA panel, but it is something that's worth noting for completeness. Now you will notice I just showed you what the VA glow, as I call it, looks like from off angle, and it blooms out. You can see this from a normal viewing position in front of the monitor as well, a little bit towards the bottom of the screen, but this is about as low as I've actually seen on a VA model. The VA glow of this model is actually a bit lower than on the Samsung C24G1, which I reviewed, which uses a similar but slightly older version of this panel. But there is a little bit. It doesn't really do a lot to affect the atmosphere of dark scenes because it's pretty subtle, and that's when you're sitting in a dark room. If you've got a bit of lighting in the room, you really don't notice this VA glow at all, or at least I don't. And it does depend on your viewing position, so if you're sitting quite close to the screen, then it does magnify this glow a bit, but I tend to sit sort of, even 60 centimeters I consider quite close, so I tend to be a little bit further than that, and this VA glow is really sort of drowned out at that distance and it's not obvious. And certainly compared to some curved VA models, it's just not as extreme. And it's, again, something which I like to mention for completeness, like the black crush, even though I don't see it as a major issue on this monitor. I'm now going to talk about the colour reproduction characteristics of the monitor, and to start this section off, I like to look at the Lagom viewing angles test, so that's the lagom.nl website. The first part of the viewing angles test, the text test, ideally this would look a completely blended grey throughout without any obvious tint to the striping of the text. On this model you do instead get, it's largely kind of blended grey, but there is actually a bit of a green tint towards the top and a red tint towards the bottom, and this shifts as you move your head movement. And these are again related to the viewing angle shifts which I noted before, but you might notice that there's actually more of a blended grey towards the centre of the screen in a kind of cone again, and this sort of shifts as you move your head, and the nature of the blending kind of changes as you shift your head or the camera. And this is again very similar to what causes the black crush. It's changes in perceived gamma depending on which part of the screen you're looking at. This also has an effect on solid shades as well. These are not as obvious when you're in a game or anything like that, but in this Lagom test you can see solid areas of colour filling pretty much the entire screen. And even then, from a reasonable viewing position, again quite centrally but sitting some distance from the monitor, 60 centimeters plus, the shifts are actually quite constrained for a VA model. Overall this looks like quite a solid lilac colour. There is a bit of pink hue which is stronger towards the bottom of the screen and towards the edges, particularly the bottom corners of the screen. And this pink hue, it shifts as you move your head as well. But if you compare this to what you see on a TN model, for example, you'd see a really strong pink hue towards the bottom, and it very, very quickly will transition to a more obvious purple colour higher up, and it'll be quite a brutal sort of transition, almost looks like a gradient. And you see the same thing with the red block. With this model, this is really quite a consistent and fairly rich red throughout. There's a little bit of a more kind of burnt hue, or a bit of a duller look towards the edges. This does increase if you are closer to the monitor. There's a sort of intense zone in the middle of the screen, and there's a more of a burnt or duller look around that. But from a normal viewing position, it's really quite a good intense red throughout. On a TN model, by comparison, you'd notice that it looks a pretty vibrant red at the top, but it very quickly goes to a burnt red, and then quite a strong pink hue further down. The green block, really quite a good solid green. It has a little bit of a yellow quality to it, but that's normal for a monitor with this kind of colour gamut, and I'll talk a little bit about that in-game, as it's a bit more relevant there. Again, on a TN model, you'd notice more obvious shifts and a more obvious yellow hue towards the bottom. The blue block, as always, is just a nice solid blue. I'm now running Battlefield 1, and I'm going to talk about colour reproduction with an in-game example. The colour gamut of this monitor is very close to sRGB. I actually recorded 99% sRGB, so that's very good sRGB coverage with a tiny bit of under coverage. It also has a little bit of over coverage in the green region and the red region of the gamut, or some of the green and red region of the gamut, I should say. So what that means is that things look largely as they should, or they have the potential to look largely as the developers intend. Content such as this game, they're designed with sRGB in mind as the colour space because that's the most common standard supported by most devices. The slight over coverage does give a little bit of extra vibrancy as well, which many users will like. but the extra vibrancy is not really particularly strong because the extra coverage of the gamut is not particularly extensive either. So you don't get the kind of vibrant pop you'd get on a model with a much wider colour gamut, and certainly if you compare the colour gamut of this to the Samsung C24FG70 and C24FG73, you'll notice that the colour gamut is quite a bit more restricted on this model. Another very important consideration is the gamma, because that will affect how saturated shades look as well, and certainly dodgy gamma or gamma that's too low is known to make quite a lot of the competing TN models look washed out. And as I'd mentioned before, the perceived gamma on TN models is a lot lower down the screen, and that just floods the image and makes things look very unsaturated towards the bottom, whereas at the top of a TN model things look much deeper and more saturated. You don't get that kind of effect on this because the consistency is much better. And in terms of the calibration, it has 3 different gamma modes, and they're explored in the written review in more detail. But what I found is, even using the optimal gamma mode, or the one that was closest to the 2.2 curve, which you would sort of target for normal PC usage or indeed normal console usage, I found that the gamma was a little bit below that. It was close to 2.1 on average, so that just sort of sapped a little bit of depth and saturation in places. It wasn't extreme though, but it was enough so that I found that calibrating it and profiling it properly with a proper ICC profile, I found that that just gave a little bit of edge in terms of richness. So I have included an ICC profile in the written review, and I'm running that with the monitor now in all of my testing. In fact, I'm having the ICC profile applied. But as I note in the review and in the article on ICC profiles on the website, some games kind of ignore this, and sometimes things don't look quite right. But usually it's a problem with monitors where the profile makes massive corrections and it looks horribly washed out without the profile. This monitor, however, looks quite rich without the profile, so most of the time you won't even notice if it's not activated. So you don't have to worry too much about that. It's just a bit of a bonus if you can have it properly calibrated. So the overall colour representation is rich and natural, that's how I'd describe it. Things look largely as the developers would intend. There's a little bit of extra saturation as well, which some users will quite like. But it has a nice variety of shades as well. The consistency helps in that respect. I think I like actually using this particular part of Battlefield 1 to talk about the colour performance of the monitor, because this sort of, the sand on the desert here has a slight rich red hue to it, and a kind of slightly orangey golden glow. And if the colour gamut is too wide, the red hue is actually far too strong, and that kind of makes it look a bit odd. It's not too bad, but it just doesn't quite look as it should. Whereas here it looks more natural. It has a kind of more golden brown hue to it and a little bit of red, but that slight red tint's really intended. And same with the greens, they look quite muted where they should, so there's some good khaki shades, but there's some nice richer hues as well. These deep greens are quite impressive on this model. But again, they're not as deep and lush as they would be on a model with a wider colour gamut. The same with the sky as well. It looks quite vibrant, but it doesn't look sort of overly vibrant and almost artificial as it might with a monitor with a much wider colour gamut. It looks more natural. And you also notice that the colour consistency being strong means that the sky doesn't look ridiculously deep towards the top of the screen and much more sort of muted lower down. The consistency is much better than that, and it looks quite consistent throughout. Obviously there are various different shades, but that's just part of the game, and that's how how the sky looks in real life, so that's entirely intended. The colour consistency, again, it's not quite up to the standards you'd get from a decent IPS type model. So there is a little bit of saturation loss towards the edge of the screen in the bottom, but from a decent viewing position, and as I keep saying, I'd say maybe 60 centimetres plus. I tend to be about 70 centimetres away from the screen, quite centrally. From that kind of viewing position, you hardly notice these shifts when you're gaming because they're really quite subtle. And they're even more subtle than on Lagom, where even then they weren't exactly particularly extreme. So compared to many VA models, the colour consistency of this is strong. Compared to TN models, it's just in a completely different league. So the overall colour reproduction on this monitor I find works quite nicely for its intended uses. But because of the perceived gamma shifts and the saturation shifts, I do have to warn against using any VA panel, even one with good colour consistency like this one, for colour critical work, because although these shifts are subtle, they do slightly change the shade, so you can calibrate the screen so it's perfect in the centre, but you can't necessarily say that the shade is going to look quite the same towards the flanks of the screen or the bottom, so just be aware of that. I'm now running Battlefield 1 and I'm going to talk about responsiveness. This monitor is a 144Hz monitor, and as you can perhaps see from the frame rate counter in the top right there, it's running at a pretty consistent 144 frames a second, or thereabout. You'll see a bit of fluctuation, but that's mainly from the GPU. I've got VSync on and everything's running at about 144 frames a second. What this means is the monitor is outputting over twice the visual information every second as a 60Hz monitor would. And one thing which you'd notice, and this is something you can notice as soon as you use a 144Hz monitor, or most users can notice, because sensitivity to this does vary, and that is that the connected feel is a lot better. So when you're playing a game like this and you move your character around, or move the mouse in particular, you just notice a kind of fluidity and a connectedness to the game world that is lacking from monitors with lower refresh rates. And another element which really helps with this is the fact that this monitor has very low input lag, or low input lag. I can't remember exactly what I measured, but I think it was somewhere around 3 milliseconds, so it doesn't have much signal delay at all. And when combined with the 144Hz refresh rate, it really does give an excellent connected feel, and the precision and sort of level of fluidity when you're interacting with the game world is very good. There's an important concept which is talked about in a little bit of detail in the written review, and also in a linked article there, all about the responsiveness of monitors, and it is the concept of perceived blur. And the major contributor to this on a modern monitor such as this is actually eye movement. And eye movement is something which is decreased significantly as you increase the refresh rate. This is all explored, as I've said, in the written review and in the article, so I'm not going to waste time repeating too much of that. But essentially it means that the perceived blur is massively reduced compared to a 60Hz monitor. And this particular part of perceived blur has nothing to do with pixel responsiveness. So you could have a theoretical response time of 0.0001 millisecond, and you'd still get this mask of perceived blur due to eye movement, and that's closely linked to the refresh rate on sample and hold LCD monitors like this. So that doesn't really matter. The pixel responsiveness doesn't matter for that element of perceived blur. However, the pixel responsiveness does indeed contribute to perceived blur, and weaknesses in that will add to perceived blur. This is a VA model, so they're known to have some weaknesses in pixel responsiveness, but this model actually is one of the faster VA models I've tested. It does have some weaknesses, but most of the pixel transitions are performed fast enough to give a really good 144Hz performance. So the overall perceived blur isn't really affected too much for most transitions by this. There's a little bit of what I call powdery trailing. I can see it, for example, in the background there. There's just a little bit of powdery trailing which adds a little bit of perceived blur, but it's nothing major and nothing eye-catching for those kind of transitions. This is with the medium response time setting, the medium overdrive setting on the monitor. If you use the strong overdrive setting, and I'll come on to that, it does improve on this by getting rid of this powdery trailing, and it improves other things, but I'm going to talk about this a bit more using some other examples on Battlefield 1, because as a VA model the weaknesses generally surround these higher contrast transitions, so where there are darker shades involved in the transition, for example some darker shades in here, you can see some what I'd call more heavy powdery trailing, and this adds a greater degree of perceived blur, but it's again not massively eye-catching. There are, however, some better examples of this which you'll see when you're gaming on much darker maps, or when you look at much darker transitions with some brighter transitions around it. You can also see some of this sort of heavy powdery trailing, as I called it, around this light object here, this sort of icon above the crate. And you might not be able to see this on the video because As I've mentioned, what you see on the video depends on various factors, but it's definitely very difficult to capture this on a video, this kind of trailing behaviour. But I can see a sort of powdery trailing behind the object, and it has an almost smeary look, but I wouldn't really go as far as to call it smeary trailing because it's not really that extended or bold. I'm now running Battlefield 1 with a different scene, and this one has plenty of high contrast transitions. There are lots of really dark shades, and this really explores the extreme weaknesses that VA models like this have. And when I say extreme weaknesses, I mean the relative weaknesses. So there are some pixel responses here which are significantly slower than some of the faster ones, which are much more common on this monitor. So behind the horse, there is what some people would describe as a kind of smeary trail. You can see, again, I'm not sure if this will come out in the video, but behind various dark elements on the horse, I can see a kind of, perhaps you'd call it a heavy powdery trail, but it has a bit more of a smeary quality to it because the pixel responses there are quite slow. And this is essentially what I like to call breakup trailing. And what you'll get is there are some shades which are not quite black, but sort of very dark shades, which when you just look at the screen, they just appear essentially black. But there's some slight hues of sort of red and purple in the horse there, and some browns. And they actually leach out a bit in this smeary trailing. And you can see some slightly colourful fringe around the horse for that reason. This is something I liken to wetting ink on a page, particularly from an old pen, like a fountain pen. If you wet the ink, some of the colours in the ink run out, and you can kind of see the effect there. But on this model, and in this example, the smeary trailing is really quite constrained, so it's not actually very eye-catching or obvious at all, and it actually only runs out a little bit, and it actually stays quite close to the object itself, so it's by no means extreme. You can again see it a little bit around the shadows on these rocks here, but not extreme. There are some examples of slightly more obvious smeary trailing or more obvious breakup trailing. If you look at the rock there in the background, there's a kind of slight purple glow around it, but I should mention at this point that it is not the same as the purple trailing you see on the Samsung C24G1 or 73 models. That's actually caused by overshoot, and that's bright and eye-catching for that reason. This is not overshoot, again, these are weaknesses caused by slower than optimal pixel transitions. So these aren't as bright and eye-catching, but some users are sensitive to this kind of thing, so you might notice it, and you might be able to pick up on the video. You can actually see it more clearly around the pylon here. You can see the kind of, sort of a purple trail around it. It's not exactly extreme, but it is there. And really that's the most obnoxious weakness I experienced on this monitor. I've played a lot of other game titles as well, and some of them have lots of these high contrast transitions. Tomb Raider, for example, has these everywhere, and I really didn't find the enjoyment of that title impeded by the weaknesses. I found overall it had quite a competent 144Hz performance, and I really quite enjoyed playing Tomb Raider on this monitor. Now I will come on to the strong overdrive setting because this definitely has merit as well, and I apologise in advance because this OSD system is quite difficult to use in the dark because there's no sort of proper button labelling, no illumination there, but I did manage to set the overdrive to strong, and what this does is it speeds up the pixel transitions quite a lot. So these weaknesses are basically not there to the same degree. The powdery trailing I was talking about before is as good as gone now, so you do actually get a decrease in perceived blur, and that is nice. The weaker transitions, the sort of the smeary trailing, if you like, or the breakup trailing, that's reduced as well, so you can't really see that to the same extent. There is a bit of it, but there's actually a fair bit of overshoot. In general, the overshoot is not extreme, and I don't find it particularly eye-catching. However, there are some examples where it is quite eye-catching. So around the moon here, for example, there's an obvious dark trail, and I'm not sure if this will come out properly on the video, but it's quite eye-catching to me. It looks like a very dark trail around the moon, and that's overshoot. So you can see also some sort of brighter overshoot trailing, slightly more colourful overshoot trailing around the rock face there as well. and I think there's some more examples around the pylon there. That's probably not the best example. You can also see it to some extent around the stars there, but they're really quite small objects and you can't see it in an obvious way there. So if you aren't particularly sensitive to overshoot and you actually do like a lower level of perceived blur, then by all means try the strong setting. I found the medium setting preferable overall, but I did quite like the strong setting, and from a competitive point of view I definitely see the merit in this because it does reduce the perceived blur. If you're running games at consistently high frame rates like this, and you want a competitive edge, you want the lowest level of perceived blur, and you don't really mind too much about some of this overshoot and that kind of thing, then you should check out the MBR, motion blur reduction feature of the monitor as well. You can see there MBR in the game settings section of the OSD. As I mentioned elsewhere in the written review and on the OSD video, if you've got FreeSync enabled, then you can't use MBR. You have to use one or the other, and MBR really works properly only if the frame rate of the game is matching your refresh rate exactly. So if you enable this, so you can set this to 1 or anything higher, you might see some flickering on the video. That isn't as obvious in real life as it is on the video, but sensitivity to flickering does vary. And you might notice a higher MBR setting dims the backlight and a lower setting is a bit brighter. So this is a flexibility you didn't have on the Samsung models because it used a very high brightness, which most users found uncomfortably bright no matter what you set it to. So you get a bit of flexibility. What this is actually changing is the pulse width, so how long the strobe backlight is on for versus off. This is all explained in the written review, so I'm not going to repeat too much of that here. I found a setting of 10 to give a nice sort of compromise between low blur and a decent brightness. And again, I've got the overdrive set to strong, and as I explore in the review, if you've got MBR on and use anything lower than strong, things just look completely messed up. There's a massive amount of what's called strobe crosstalk, and there's just basically repetitions of all of your objects, and it just sort of defeats the purpose of the blur reduction. So strong is really the setting to use if you're using MBR. And all you're going to see is probably just flickering on the video, but when you actually use this to your eyes, you can really notice a huge reduction in perceived blur due to eye movement. The eye movement is reduced massively with this setting enabled, and this really does give a great competitive edge. Overshoot is definitely an issue with this. Again, it's using the strong settings, so you can see those examples of stronger overshoots. If anything, they're a bit stronger with MBR on, or a bit more noticeable. And it's a bit of what I call strobe crosstalk, and that's all explored in the review. There's also some strobe crosstalk, which I explore in the written review, so you can see some sort of repetitions of objects. But actually, as I mentioned, when you're just gaming, the main thing you will notice is a reduction in perceived blur. Things just look sharper, more cleanly focused, things are more detailed as you're moving rapidly. So if you are a competitive gamer and you can have the frame rate suitably high, then the NBR mode is definitely worth checking out. This monitor also supports AMD FreeSync on compatible systems and GPUs, and this comes into its own when the frame rate is dipping below what would be the static refresh rate of 144 Hz. So when your frame rate dips below 144 frames a second, FreeSync can be very useful. I'm going to have to increase the graphics settings a bit so I actually see some dips below that. So now my frame rate does not stay at 144 frames a second. There are some fluctuations around 130, it dips a bit below that. In this example, closer to 100 frames a second at times. And with FreeSync, everything appears quite smooth. You do notice as the frame rate reduces that the connected feel is worse, and indeed the perceived blur is increased, exactly as you'd get without FreeSync enabled, because with or without FreeSync, reduced frame rate does increase perceived blur and it worsens the connected feel. So FreeSync doesn't change that. Lower frame rates are still lower frame rates, and you do get a reduction in the nice sort of benefits of the higher frame rate. But things do look quite smooth and flowing still, even though the frame rate has reduced quite a bit below the 144 frames a second at times. If you had FreeSync disabled, you'd either notice stuttering if you have VSync on, and to me this is very obvious and jarring. I'm sensitive to that. Or you'd notice tearing if you have VSync off and FreeSync disabled. And again, I'm sensitive to that, and I really do notice it very easily. If you increase the graphics settings further, and obviously the exact settings you're using depends on the game, it depends on your system, and particularly your graphics card. So some graphics cards will sort of struggle, and in some games you'll struggle and get further dips that are well below 100 frames a second. And to get that effect on mine, I'll just increase the resolution scale a bit. So now I have further dips to the frame rate. It's sort of 76 frames a second, 75 frames a second at the moment. Again, the connected feel has gone, the perceived blur is considerably higher, but FreeSync's enabled, so I don't get this obnoxious tearing or stuttering from refresh rate and frame rate mismatches. And that's really nice, that's a nice bonus. Because at these kind of lower frame rates, stuttering in particular becomes really quite easy to notice. So many users would like to have FreeSync enabled at these kind of frame rates. With some FreeSync models, there is a more obvious amount of overshoot at these reduced frame rates. On this model, however, it's not really an issue. With the medium setting, which I'm using at the moment, I should have really mentioned that I've switched back to medium for the testing at the moment. There's a little bit more overshoot. I can see a little bit around the moon there, but it's quite faint. And really there's nothing particularly eye-catching, and especially as far as FreeSync models go, this is one of the better optimised for the lower frame rates and refresh rates as well. So you don't have to worry about extra overshoot. But if you are using the strong setting, a word of warning here, the overshoot now becomes very obvious. There is extremely strong overshoot around the moon there. I'd be very surprised if you couldn't see this in the video. Around the stars as well, you can see it. And there's some bright, what I call halo trailing, so there's kind of a bright trailing which is much brighter than even the background colour here around the rocks. So this is all introduced at the lower frame rate, and if I reduce the frame rate further, this will hopefully increase, I'll just increase the resolution scale a bit. This becomes really extreme. So I'm at sort of nearly 60 frames a second now, and there's extreme overshoot. That's really eye-catching, and I find it really bothersome. So if you are in a variable frame rate environment and you're finding that your game is fluctuating a lot, and it's often in this double digits, not so much the triple digits, the medium setting for overdrive really is what I call a no-brainer. It just makes a much more comfortable experience at these sort of lower frame rates. Now notice my frame rate counter's gone red, and it's at about 46 frames a second at the moment, fluctuates a little bit. This is important because the lowest refresh rate that this monitor will set itself to is 48 Hz. That is the floor of operation for FreeSync. I'm not aware of any FreeSync monitors which out of the box will go any lower than 48 Hz when they've got a 144 Hz refresh rate. So this is actually decent for a FreeSync monitor. What happens when it goes lower than that, however, lower than the 48 Hz or 48 frames a second, is that the monitor uses, or the system uses something called LFC, low frame rate compensation, and it will stick to a multiple of the frame rate with its refresh rate. This is a bit clearer if you turn on the frame rate counter feature on the monitor itself. It's called a frame counter, but actually what it does is show you the refresh rate that the monitor is currently running at. So I'll set this to left up so you can see it in the top left corner of the screen. So you can now see the number there is a lot higher than the number there. That's because this is the frame rate of the game and this is the refresh rate of the monitor. And the monitor is essentially doubling its refresh rate. And that does get rid of tearing and stuttering, and it works quite nicely. But what I would say is when LFC activates, so you're at the boundary between the activation and it using its normal FreeSync, so it's using normal FreeSync at the moment because it's over 48 frames a second. whereas when it dips down, LFC activates, and at the point of activation there's a momentary stuttering, and this is not unique to this monitor. It's something which I've noticed on many monitors with LFC, probably all monitors with LFC if I'm actually looking out for it. So if you are running a game which is frequently at the boundary, so it's around 48 frames a second, sometimes above, sometimes below, this could be a bit bothersome to you. But if it's just an occasional thing where it just goes below every now and then or above every now and then, I wouldn't really worry about this. And as far as I'm concerned, as someone who's sensitive to tearing, stuttering and indeed frame rate, I actually prefer the frame rate being as high as possible on this monitor regardless of FreeSync being active. So well above 48 frames a second. To wrap up then, one of the key headline features of this monitor is the fact it has a curved screen, 1500R curve in fact, so it's a bit steeper than competing models with a 1800R curve. And if you look at the images of that curved screen, some of the press shots, particularly if they're angled, and indeed on the video you might even see this, it sort of makes it look almost pin-cushioned, and you might be a bit afraid that it's distorting the image. In practice, when you're sitting centrally in front of the monitor, or fairly centrally, and you're using it, you soon adapt to the curve, or I certainly do. And it's not something that I consider particularly noticeable. So that's both a good and bad thing, I suppose. It doesn't really add an awful lot to the experience. And part of this is because although it's a relatively steep curve on paper, the screen is actually only 23.6 inches wide diagonally, and that means the width itself is not extreme, and the curve is generally more noticeable on wider screens than this. So the curve is sort of what I consider a subtle addition. It doesn't make the image seem distorted in any way to me. It seems completely natural, and it just adds a little bit of extra depth and immersion. Full HD resolution of this monitor is not going to win any awards in terms of pixel density, and it doesn't give you a huge amount of desktop real estate. However, it sort of makes sense for users, well, in terms of the price of the monitor for one thing, but also it is easier to run higher frame rates at the Full HD resolution than at a higher resolution. And this is a 144Hz monitor, and that's one of its key selling points. With a VA panel, it has strong contrast, and that's expected from a VA model, although there is always a bit of variability in terms of VA contrast. This monitor is sort of, I'd consider it fairly middle ground for VA in terms of contrast, because it's not super strong. It doesn't give kind of 5000 to 1 plus static contrast, but it is actually stronger than on some of the weakest VA models, and there are two reasons for that. One is that the static contrast I recorded was actually a bit above 3000 to 1 generally, and I think it was around 3000 to 1 once I've actually calibrated it fully, and that's actually very good. So if you compare that to the curved AOC C24G1 on UCG 6, the contrast of those monitors is close to 2000 to 1, which is a little bit disappointing really for a VA panel. It's better than other VA panel types, and you kind of do notice a bit of a difference, but the step up to sort of 3000 to 1 is quite noticeable. Another thing which I find quite noticeable, especially compared to the curved ultra-wide model I just mentioned, and ones using the same panel, is that this monitor has quite a low level of VA glow. VA glow is nothing like IPS glow. It's never like IPS glow, so it doesn't eat away at detail in the same way as IPS glow. But it does kind of lighten the image a bit towards the bottom of the screen, and in particular towards the bottom corners. On this monitor, I didn't really find it particularly bothersome at all, the VA glow. And actually, unless I was in a pitch black room, I didn't really notice it. And even when I was playing darker games like Tomb Raider, where there were loads of dark caverns and caves and stuff, I really didn't find it bothersome. And I found the overall atmospheric look on this monitor really good. And especially compared to competing 144Hz TN models, the atmosphere was just much better. Colour reproduction is good on this monitor overall. It did have some slight issues with gamma, and that is that regardless of the setting you used in the OSD, gamma was not quite ever spot on the 2.2 curve. It was either quite a bit above this or a little bit below. So I actually decided to profile this monitor, calibrate it with an ICC profile, full calibration. And this is something which you can find in the written review. You can find a link to download the ICC profile. So feel free to use this if you want, but be aware that individual units do vary. So this isn't necessarily going to be optimal for all users. but it may hopefully, if nothing else, improve the gamma performance a bit. But I would also say that even without the ICC profile activated, the image on this monitor is far from washed out, and especially compared to the competing TN models, colours are actually quite rich and quite natural looking, and the colour consistency is much better. When you're viewing it from a sort of central viewing position, there's a little bit of loss of saturation towards the bottom and the side of the screen, but compared to the vertical saturation loss and indeed the extreme saturation and deeper look you get higher up on a TN model, the consistency of the gamma is essentially a lot better on this monitor than the TN model, and that helps make colours look quite rich and consistent throughout the screen. The colour gamut is quite close to sRGB. There's just a tiny little sliver of undercoverage, nothing really to worry about, and that might not even apply to all units because it was such a small amount of undercoverage, and it might depend on the calibration device you're actually using to measure the gamut. There's also a little bit of overextension, but only a little bit. So what this means is it gives a little bit of vibrancy beyond the sRGB colour space, so a little bit of extra saturation. And it works quite well for the intended purposes of this monitor. But it doesn't give you the level of saturation you'd see on a monitor with a much more generous colour gamut. For example, the Samsung C24G1 with its quantum dot solution does have some more saturated colours. But depending on your point of view, this can be a good or bad thing, because the colour representation of this monitor is technically more accurate. And it does have, some extra saturation, but it's not extreme. So moving on from that, the screen surface, it's something which affects the presentation of colours, but also the representation of lighter shades in particular. It's quite a smooth surface that's used on this monitor, a light matte screen surface with a smooth surface texture. So there's no obvious graininess. There's a little bit of graininess here and there, but nothing that really stands out. So the smoothness of the screen surface is definitely something that I appreciate compared to the TN models, which use a grainier medium matte screen surface. In terms of responsiveness, the monitor puts its 144Hz refresh rate to good use. It has low input lag, and it has pretty good pixel responsiveness for the panel type. There are some weaknesses. If you're using the medium overdrive setting, which I kind of on balance prefer overall, you will notice some powdery trailing, or you may notice some powdery trailing in places, and a little bit of perhaps smeary trailing or breakup trailing as I call it, but nothing extreme, especially compared to some VA models. And if you compare it, for example, to the AOC Q3279 VWF, the pixel responses are actually a lot better overall than that, and the slowest pixel responses aren't as bad at all. If you use the strong overdrive setting, you really get rid of a lot of that powdery trailing, and you also reduce the sort of smeary trailing, but you get a bit of overshoot in place. Sensitivity to that varies. Some users would like it, some users wouldn't like it, so feel free to experiment with both settings. The monitor supports FreeSync, and that worked very well, and using the medium overdrive setting I actually found that the pixel responsiveness was very nice for the lower frame rates as well. There wasn't any obnoxious overshoot added. If you use the strong setting, however, there was obnoxious overshoot. There's some really strong overshoot at the lower frame rates. If you don't have FreeSync active, or you're using an NVIDIA GPU, then the monitor reacts at 144Hz, and the pixel responsiveness is very similar regardless. You don't actually get these sort of changes in overshoot levels, but you will of course get the tearing and stuttering which you may notice if you've got FreeSync deactivated. In terms of aesthetics, I found this monitor quite nice, just to look at on the desk. It didn't really have anything that bothered me, and some monitors, quite a few monitors, especially gaming monitors, often have bright colours and some elements which just annoy some users. I found the design of this monitor quite good in that respect. It had some sort of subtle hints of colour, a darker red stripe under the bottom bezel, and some more elements around the stand and at the rear as well. And the shape of the stand I found quite interesting without looking really weird. A nice matte plastic used at the bottom. I say nice because I don't like glossy fingerprint magnet plastic myself. Slender bezels at the top and side. Works quite nicely as a standalone with a single monitor on the desk, but if you're using it as a multi-monitor setup, the thin side bezels are really quite useful, and the curve of the monitor as well would sort of be accentuated by having multiple displays on the desk. So if you have a massive desk and you have the budget for it and the system to run it, then perhaps do consider a multi-monitor setup with these. Overall, I found the combination of image quality and responsiveness pleasing on this monitor. And with the price thrown into the mix as well, it really is quite an attractive proposition. If you're a gamer who's not super competitive and you're looking for a kind of mix of image quality and responsiveness, then I think this is an excellent choice. And if you are a competitive gamer, or you sort of have a mix of more competitive and less competitive gaming, the motion blur reduction feature is something you might like to use on this monitor as well, and I feel it's implemented a lot better than it is on the competing Samsung monitors. So really that's all there is to the AOC C24G1. Be sure to check out the full review on PCmonitors.info. There's a link to that in the description of the video, alongside information about how you can support the work that we do.